Well, she set me up perfectly for my first question that I have for our panel. And that is really, how do we take some of the lessons that we've learned locally and bring them to the state agencies that are managing our land? I mentioned briefly that locally we have a policy that does not allow for pesticide use in ditches or places that convey to the Russian River or Laguna, and that the stormwater permit for Caltrans, for example, does allow for that. Also, another thing, locally, we've had some policies that require notification before pesticides were sprayed if they needed to be at a park, for example. So how are, these are just two kind of examples of things that we've done that have ended up moving the dial toward less toxins being used. So what are some ways that we can communicate with our state land managers to try to have them implement some of these policies? And let me know if anyone wants to go first.
I think I'll just share just a more pragmatic example of just sort of one of the adaptations we've seen here, and how I think it's applicable in just a greater mindset of urban and just infrastructure and urban. The shoulders and whatnot along our trails, park driveways, gravel, highly permeable parking lots. That was a big, it's kind of a big deal. I mean, we've learned a lot actually since discontinuing use of herbicides, because in many cases the choices were use herbicide, use a digging bar tool, use a weed whacker, which we broke a lot of our windshields over the years to try to stop that. That's a joke. But there's a piece of this stuff that's infrastructure, whereas I think about the roadways, for example, our shoulders. We have invested in fairly modest equipment now that actually allows our tractor attachments to refresh the gravel shoulders with a compactor going behind them. We've found at 5 to 6 inches of shale, road-based shale compacted down to 4 inches, pretty much stops our weeds for about 2.5 years, and then needs to be refreshed. So we have this tight maintenance schedule, and they're just like little things like that in the parking lots, like just coming up with these techniques to try and solve the problem in a way that actually makes sense. And it is more work. It does take a little bit more resources, but at the end of the day, it's actually, becomes not as big of a burden as you might think once the systems are changed and the investments have been made.
I forgot to mention that we are taking audience questions. Nicole Warwick in the back has some note cards if anyone wants to submit questions to her. Thank you.
One example that I want to share is actually coming before the Board of Supervisors on Tuesday for consideration, and that is we are actually putting anti-pesticide language into our local coastal plan. And the way that we're able to do this without subverting sort of the authority of DPR is that ultimately this is approved by the Coastal Commission. And the Coastal Commission as a state agency is sort of asserting jurisdiction in this area and saying that yes, as we issue coastal development permits, we could actually include prohibitions on that kind of routine use of pesticides. And so again, the policy that will be on before the board, in case you're following C-OSRC-7C, but it includes development that involves the use of pesticides, including insecticides, herbicides, rodenticides, or any other similar toxic chemical substance, shall be prohibited in cases where the application of such substances would have the potential to significantly degrade ESHA, which is environmentally sensitive habitat area, or coastal water quality, or harm wildlife. So we're actually actively soliciting support from state agencies to reduce pesticides. And I would love to hear, from your perspective over here, are there other opportunities? Obviously, Caltrans has come up, that's a huge one in Sonoma County, of how can we expand some of these local practices upwards? And is that something that you've had conversations at all with some of your colleagues at other state agencies about?
Well, thanks for that. And I think one of the things that Claire and I would like to do, especially as we're getting to the point with the work group and with the stage we are with the roadmap, in looking at how can we best partner with our state agency partners. I think hearing from you about what practices you have been successful for you and how you'd like to see them expanded would be really helpful. I also think working together with Andrew and his office, I think the collaboration between us at the state level, the local county ag commissioner, and you at the county level, sharing what those best practices are so that we can then share them more broadly at the state level. One of the other things that we've been talking about with the work group is establishing sort of regional cooperatives that could share best practices, but also collaborate because pests don't know borders. And so thinking about how they can be managed more effectively at a regional level. So I think some of the recommendations that are going to be coming out from the roadmap, I think will be opportunities for us to look at how we can collaborate better at the state and local level.
And I just wanted to mention that as part of my emphasis areas, I forgot to mention that part of it is about working with and across the state agencies, because we too need to move in this direction, sustainable pest management on state lands. That is outlined in the roadmap. So it doesn't directly address your question. I think Julie answered it best, how as some of the avenues of communication, and we're thinking about this as well, as we get feedback into the sustainable pest management roadmap, hopefully those will come through. We definitely know we need to have ways that we interact at local, regional, and statewide levels.
Thank you. Question from the audience, and I forgot to mention myself, is that Mendocino and Humboldt counties, their roadways have been managed for 20 years without any toxins and chemicals. So something to think about is how do we bring their lessons learned, their decades worth of lessons learned here. We're in a different region than they are. They're region 1, we're region 4, so some of it might be, as you were talking about, Julie, just state agencies not sharing stories between themselves. So another area, a place that we could potentially get some more lessons learned.
Thank you. I have a quick question. One thing we talked about, Bert talked a little bit about, is the resources needed for transition. Not only the funds, but also education of staff, education of leaders. And we had a pretty, hear from both of these parties, the difficulties, but that's a big piece of it, is that transition. And I love the healthy soils. I know we have a lot of resources for that. Is there resources for statewide entities to give that support? Because I know the transition, finding the funding and support and training transition is going to be one of the biggest hurdles in that statewide evolution. Is there funding or support for that kind of transition available to these statewide entities?
Awesome question. We are actually in the process of conducting a study of the department's funding. The current structure is based on pesticide sales and use, and so our department is 80% of it is funded based on the sales of pesticides in California. That is not really a sustainable model if we're trying to move towards safer and more sustainable pest management practices. So part of what we are doing with this study is both looking at the department's current funding and what programs we're able to carry out with that level of funding, but also looking at what do we need as a state to be able to move more comprehensively to safer and more sustainable pest management practices. To your point, it's not something that just happens because we say it's going to happen. It actually requires a lot of resources and support. And so part of the function of this roadmap will feed into the study, and then we'll be presenting recommendations to the legislature about what we think our funding should look like going forward. And so actually, all of you could be very helpful as we move into the cycle of making those recommendations for our funding. And one of the structural things that we're looking to is how the funding structure supports the use of safer and more sustainable practices and moves away from this use of pesticides funding our department. In our mission of protecting public health and the environment. The other thing that's really important about the study is that we've had a really significant stakeholder engagement part of it, including with our Ag Commissioner partners, because part of their funding as well comes from the SMIL funding, which is funding for our department. So I think the combination of recommendations that will come out with the roadmap of what's really needed to make this transition happen, including this very significant education and outreach component, as well as the development of alternatives, and really support for growers and for counties and others who are managing pests that can do it in a safe and sustainable way.
thank you for all of these thoughtful questions from the audience. I'm trying my best to put them together. I appreciate it. Here's one. I think our original question needs to be answered. How do we communicate with our state land managers? What's the best way to communicate with our state land managers? Does anyone know? If we don't know, then we don't know. Yeah.
I probably would say talk to your local state elected officials, and see if we can get them to participate in these kinds of town halls, so that then they can have those conversations and ultimately, hopefully, have some budget asks to support that transition, just as you described. Because I think it is really important. It's easy potentially for someone from state parks to say, I want to do this thing, but if they have no funds and no staff who know how to actually implement and make that change, it's never going to happen. So I do think that a collaborative conversation, we are very lucky in this area to have a variety of progressive state elected officials, one of whom is actually the majority leader for the Senate. So we have an opportunity, I think, to really get in there with some budget asks if there is a clear community consensus to head in that direction. So maybe it's an opportunity for us to reach out to Senator McGuire's office, Assemblymember Wood, Aguilar Curry, all of the local electeds, and have that conversation. And we do have a current assembly race happening, as was mentioned earlier. So I think also reaching out to the candidates to find out, what are they willing to do. I think that would be a good opportunity for everyone as well.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the state assembly race. We're a C3, we're not a political organization, but we do interview all of our candidates, and we have candidate questionnaires for both state assembly candidates that I think all of you might be interested in looking at. Both are really supportive of our work to reduce or eliminate toxins on roadways and in other public areas. And both also support notice of intent to let people know before pesticides are sprayed. So thank you, Lynda, for that comment.
Yeah, and I think one of the other important things to know when you're engaging with your representatives is that I think representatives can sometimes think that pesticides are really for agriculture only. And in fact, I was in a meeting last year with a member who was from an urban district and appreciated the meeting, but just didn't see the relevance until we started talking about pesticides are actually used in urban environments as well and in other areas. And so I think helping to be clear about the nature of the use of pesticides is also helpful. But I think for Claire and me, working with, whether it's working with Lynda or thinking about how we gather the input that you're hearing and how we can help facilitate those conversations with our state agency partners. Because part of what we want to do is, I think, just make this issue a little bit more visible. The really heavy focus on pesticides tends to be on agriculture, and people don't think about pesticide use in other contexts. And I think really highlighting this use and talking about how we want to support a transition. And I think it goes back to the funding point. This can't really happen without resources and without that support. And I'll just reiterate I think what we found, and Amy can I think confirm this on the work group, is everybody really wants to protect public health and the environment. No one wants to be using toxic chemicals if they don't have to. And so I think that's a really important point to remember. And it's just that we really have to figure out what a transition looks like and how it can be supported.
I tend to ask big, hard questions that maybe no one can answer, but I love that our Ag Commissioner here, we have a lot of conversation about agriculture as well, and then we have public land management and agriculture. We have a lot of regenerative agriculture people in our county. We have a lot of issues with the inability of public land managers to have other tools or identify other tools or have a way forward. Is there any thought of kind of taking a step back, having a holistic look on state land, connecting them with regenerative ag, so that you can have grazing through these exchanges, stewardship happening by stewards and experts on public land in a way that maybe is more sustainable for both sides. And that could be a county too. I think that we can start in a county in a more simple way, because we do a lot of collaborative land stewardship projects, but how do we connect those dots and create a system that can keep going and can provide internet access for people who really know how to attend it and take off the burden of land stewardship for the people who are burdened by that work, like public land spaces.
Well, maybe I'll start with Claire, but I think this really gets to this point of making this issue more visible. And I think that meetings like this really help. It helps raise these issues to our attention. But as Claire was saying, I mean, there's a lot of work going on at the state level in different areas, and part of what we've been trying to do better is to collaborate across state agencies, especially for these major initiatives like natural working lands. And so plugging in the pesticide issues into that work so that we can have that cross-pollination, cross-collaboration on finding solutions. And so people are not just thinking about pesticides in a silo, but really how do we think about pest management more holistically. And I think whoever was making the point, you were making the point about fire management. And you know, it's just, I think these state agencies who we haven't really had an opportunity to collaborate with, and these kinds of conversations are really helping make clear to us the kinds of conversations that we have to go back and have. So really appreciate the question and events like this to help us see what we need to see.
I just want to suggest sort of a follow-up tour at some point, because I think that regional parks and also our water agency have some really great examples of partnerships with local ranchers, you know, and sort of alternative mechanical means. And so if at some point, right, you have an opportunity to invite that, or maybe even starting with sort of local state parks folks, right, to sort of come out and share ideas and see, hey, what are the bureaucratic hurdles or the sort of financial constraints that you have that you know, how do we implement this, right? How do we copy and paste these solutions that we know are already working in the community? It can start there, and then if you're willing to, you know, potentially pull it in at a higher level at some point, would love that too. I feel like this is one of the things, one meeting begets another meeting, that's kind of how government works, right? But at least if the next one's outside, that'd be nice.
All right, here's another tricky question by someone in the know. This is mostly, I think, for Julie and Claire. What is the nexus of the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment outside of Prop 65, and how is their work informing DPR's Sustainable Pest Management Working Group and other environmental contaminants such as estrogenicity and toxics of emerging concerns? Can DPR and EPA leverage their relationship with Caltrans to build an internal policy to avoid pesticide application on public rights of way on weekends? And two guesses who asked this question. Thanks, Andrew.
These are for you, Andrew?
Yes.
Well, I'll take the first one, and then maybe I'll pass it on to Chris. But we work really closely with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and in my former role, which is not Claire's, I worked both with that office and with the Department of Pesticide Regulation very closely. So we work together closely. OEHA is the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, is known by its acronym, is one of the state agencies who we consult with on all of our regulations. We also consult with CARB, the Air Resources Board, the Department of Food and Ag, our local county ag commissioner as well. And so there is built into our regulatory process that kind of collaboration. But part of what we're looking at also as part of the work group for the State of Sustainable Pest Management is really looking at how we conduct our pesticide registration process and how we conduct our continuous evaluation of pesticides that are already registered. And so OEHA is a key partner in that work in helping us think about how are we thinking about doing those evaluations before a pesticide is registered, and how can we get safer products through faster, and how do we look at the pesticides that are already registered and prioritize those that are more hazardous to potentially have stronger restrictions on those. And so OEHA is a key partner in that. There was a second question about
I got it. Can DPR and EPA leverage their relationship with Caltrans to build an internal policy to avoid pesticide application on public rights of way, especially on weekends?
Well, certainly our ambition, as we expressed it here today, is to get these conversations going. And it's not just Caltrans, there's CalParks, there's a lot of other agencies that have a land management component to that Cal Fire. So it's our ambition to form a working group with points of contact from each of these agencies and think through this together. I think up until now, it'd be fair to say that each agency was working on its own and deciding how they managed the landscapes that they were responsible to steward. So this is an opportunity for us. We don't have authority to tell them how to do their business, but it's an opportunity for us to come together with best practices. Maybe eventually, hopefully, it leads to policy choices once we're a little better informed. But
I would just say, I think much like the members of our working group, people want to do the right thing. And so I think it's a matter of equipping our sister agencies with the tools and resources and knowledge and partnership of how to do this work in a safer and more sustainable way. And certainly, as we've said, this is a real priority for the Newsom administration. So we're really excited to be partnering with our state agency partners and to work with all of you so that we can have that kind of collaboration that I think is really constructive and I think leads to good solutions.
yeah, I just wanted to say it's our ambition that the state leads in this effort as well, since it's coming from our administration, that this is the direction we want to go. We need to also be leaders and be examples.
I actually had a question that I feel like would be helpful for everyone to understand, which is, I know the answer to it, but I think you can probably explain it much better than I can, which is, could you explain sort of, we're talking a lot about collaboration and partnerships, fully support that, but also kind of who has the hammer at different levels of government, because I do want to mention that like the policy that we passed, we actually can't here in Sonoma County ban the use of pesticides in agricultural lands, right? Ultimately, that's under state jurisdiction. So the reason we were able to pass this policy is because it was on county-owned lands, right? Using county-funded taxpayer dollars, right? The county employees or contractors were spraying. So that's how we were able to sort of pass that policy that was more progressive than the state standards. And there's also federal standards as well. So I'm kind of wondering if you could explain sort of where those authorities lie, because I think that a lot of times folks are confused about like which level of government is actually in charge here. And I just want to share one brief story, which is that a friend of mine worked in the federal, in DC, in the USDA, and actually was looking at sort of pesticide review residues in foods. And one of the things that she taught me is that actually all of the pesticide, sort of concentration and residues, it's all based on the health of a 180-pound man. So if you are a woman, if you are a child, if you are a nursing mother, if you are a nursing child, your mileage may vary. And so it's interesting to me that we have these things kind of built into the system, protections, but they aren't always adequate for all populations, including sensitive populations, and that we also have different authorities at the local, state, and federal level. So I'm wondering if you just can give like a top-level overview of kind of who holds those hammers in different places, if that's okay.
So at the highest level, there's a federal law that regulates the registration and use of pesticides. And so any pesticide used anywhere in the country has to be registered with US EPA. And then different states have different regulations and laws about how they regulate. But in California, our department, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, is a state agency that's charged with regulating pesticides. So we're responsible for registering them at the state level. So what that means is we do an additional level of review looking at California conditions in addition to what's reviewed at the state level. And then we will register with any appropriate limitations on use depending on human health or environmental concerns. Then at the local level, the registration and the use of pesticides is enforced by Andrew and his colleagues, the local county ag commissioners. And so there is what's called, in legal terms, preemption. And so getting at what you were talking about, Lynda, the regulation of pesticides is conducted at the state level. Counties can, on their own land, have policies that control use, but the regulation overall of pesticides is at the state level.
have one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to public for a question or comment. The question is, how could we get notifications globally? Is that something that DPR or EPA could help, or Ag Commissioner can help us get notifications? I'm not talking agricultural notifications, I'm talking about notifications if state agencies or even our county agencies or city agencies use pesticides in your schools, in your homes. We know about the quarter-mile requirement for ag to notify schools if they're going to spray, but we don't have much as far as the other jurisdictions. Do you have any comments on that?
So we are at the moment developing a statewide pesticide notification system, but it is really focused on agricultural pesticides, and part of what we're doing is leveraging an existing system of regulating what's known as restricted material pesticides. You may be familiar with those. And so we're building on that system because they require a permit and an actual notice before applying. And so we're in the process of developing that system and hope to be implementing it in 2024. So we've done a number of pilots in different counties and are in the process of still refining the design of that system. There, as you mentioned, Megan, there are the schools regulations that require notification, but we're starting here.
Thank you. So it sounds like nothing yet. If we wanted support from DPR or Ag Commissioner's office to help get notifications from an agency like Caltrans, for example, there's not a mechanism to do that currently.
Other than the two. Yeah, so there is the schools notice, and then we are developing the statewide system. So that's at the state level. I think that there's nothing stopping you. I think if there are different types of notice that you think would be helpful from Caltrans, we're not diving into that realm. We're starting. It's a big job, I'll just say, developing the statewide system for agricultural notification. So that's where we are right now. Sorry, it's not satisfactory, probably. But.
Nope, I just want the truth. I don't want to. Oh, go ahead.
I don't want to overcommit here, but I am taking notes on two key things that have been asked here that we haven't been able to provide definitive answers for. And these are things we will both convey back to our state agency partners when we convene this working group. And one of those is what is the lines of communication? How do local and county players? That's the part. What's the point of entry? And then the notification applications. So at least we will communicate those items of concern back to the interested agency.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up to public questions or comments for the next 15 minutes. I do have a card from Mary Wyman, so if you want to come up and do a statement, you can say like, and if everybody could keep it to 2 minutes or under, that would be really helpful. Thank you.